Hello and welcome to our second event as part of the New Architecture Writers October Takeover. Thank you to everyone that joined us last week for drawing the edge to the center too. We had a lot of fruitful and thought-provoking discussions. If you missed last week's event, head over to the Architecture Foundation's YouTube channel to watch as we spoke about the edge, the center, and the in-between. For this evening's event, we'll be focusing on the relationship between architectural writing, journalism, and power. We will be exploring who and what dictates the content of architectural critique in education and media. What does design writing look like for young critics of color? What is in it for us? How does this differ, or should it differ from the established modes of architectural critique? What are the effects and implications of broadening the subject matter? These are all questions we will be addressing during this evening's event. We'll be using the hashtag power versus Palladio. So if there's something you would like to say during or after the event, please do use the hashtag and write stuff on Twitter. My name is Shawn Adams and I'll be co-hosting the event with Nana. This evening, we are joined by 5 amazing guests who have greatly contributed to architecture. Firstly, we have Lesley Lokko, who trained as an architect at the Bartlett School of Architecture. She was the founder and former director of the Graduate School of Architecture, University Johannesburg, and is the author of 11 best-selling novels. We have Leopold Lambert, who is a Paris-based trained architect and is the editor-in-chief of The Funambulist, a print/online magazine and podcast dedicated to the politics of space in the framework of the global anti-colonial, anti-racist, queer, and feminist struggles. We have Owen Hatherley, who writes regularly on the aesthetics and politics for various publications. He is the author of several books, culture editor of Tribune, and is the editor of the Alternative Guide to the London Boroughs. We have Rowan Moore, who is an architecture critic for The Observer. He was formerly the director of the Architecture Foundation, architecture critic of the Evening Standard, and editor of Blueprint magazine. And finally, we have Tom Daikof. He is a writer, historian, and broadcaster who writes about architecture, geographies, and the cities. He also teaches urban and architectural history and theory at University College London and Central St. Martin's. He has written and presented many TV and radio podcast series for the BBC, Netflix, Sky, and was previously architecture and design critic at The Times. So for this event, we will have 3 segments: architectural critique, form, and what else, architectural history and education, whose voice, and new gen, the non-conventional.
I guess we start this evening by just talking a bit about the premise of the event and the title, which is a kind of takes on a kind of double meaning. In talking about power and Palladio, or power versus Palladio, there's an acknowledgement of the power structures that are inherent to the creation, to making architecture. So when we talk about Palladio, we recognize the power structures that make his work possible, the proximity to wealth, the sort of centering of a particular narrative within architectural culture, which happens to be a Western narrative. And then the other part of talking about power in architecture is to really think about what architectural discourse and writing looks like for 5 young writers of color and what we want to write about. So the conversation began with between a conversation after an event with an eminent architectural writer talking about what a writing program like New Architecture Writers, what kinds of writing come out of it, and the idea that it went beyond kind of the traditional forms of writing, and actually the program was generating something beyond talking about just buildings, but talking about other things that might go along with the creation of buildings. So it's an exploration of these things, where architectural critique is heading, what it looks like currently, and also most importantly, I guess it's about talking about who gets to write what, because I think we can all agree that whoever writes gets to center themselves in history and gets to be the center of history. So it's talking about those inherent power structures in doing so. So without further ado, we hand over to Lesley, who would like to share a short presentation with us, and then we move on to the main discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let me get this up. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for this invitation to join you tonight. And I just want to say up front, before anything else, that the level and depth of these conversations has been absolutely outstanding. And it's such a credit to the new architecture writers and to you all individually, but also to the program. And it really is an honor to be part of it. So thank you. And I wanted to put something on the table before starting the discussion. And I hope you'll bear with me for being bossy. And yes, I was a head girl at school. I asked Shawn and Nana if I could play a very short video to kick this off, and they agreed. But before I press play on the video, I'd like to put it in context, and I promise that it won't take more than a couple of minutes. And in your description of tonight's talk, you used the word form, pointing out that architectural criticism is often limited to examination of its form or its formal qualities. One of the most challenging, I think, issues that we had at the GSA was what sort of form should a new curriculum take in order to facilitate or encourage other new architectural forms. In other words, I think we collectively understood that there were two types of form at stake. And in order to bring the second, more visible form into existence, we had to pay attention to the underlying structure of how and what we teach. The why, I think, particularly in the South African context, had already been answered by the student protests. And I think, you know, the architectural world is sick of hearing me talk about the unit system, so I'm not going to name it anymore, but rather say that, you know, what is at stake is not the unit system per se, or studio culture, or the separation of history from theory, from technology, or even the falsely oppositional relationship between drawing and writing. The bigger issue, at least from my perspective, is the courage to admit that this moment of reckoning, race, climate, inequality, we are really in the interregnum. So to use Gramsci's famous phrase, where the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born, in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. But saying we're in it is easy. Much more difficult is to form, again, literally, the conditions and the space in which an alternative proposition might take place. And I want to play something short, which is a piece of work which is simultaneously formal and critical. It is both history and theatre, it is narrative and performance, it combines oral history, and it deals unapologetically with race, gender, patriarchy, power, and privilege. And this, for me, is the architecture not of the interregnum, but of the moment just after it. I think it's a space that we all need to protect.
The puppeteers string me up. My wrists hang limp in the air. I am everything they want me to be. To be a girl is to boil over and evaporate in the same breath. To love and be loved silently. To be a boy is to get my way. To be gendered is to answer every question before it is asked. To ask no questions. I follow my cues. I say all the right lines. The puppeteer speaks in my mouth, jerks open. I speak only when I am spoken for. Obedience is a safer body than mine. His movements are my movements. As if I were just an image in the mirror, and I let it happen. Gender is a puppet show. It's ventriloquism. Whatever it takes to fool you, there is no easy escape. Costumes letting my body escape me. But I am learning how to become, how to fight through dysphoria and disobey, to untangle this body from the girl I was once woven into, to unbuoy my joints from whittle blocks. I snapped the strings that have held me safe but sorry. They snap back and leave telemark bruises. One, for every time I let my femininity be replaced by whatever it is I've escaped to. Change is not easy. I wish my body didn't need a gender. I wish I didn't have to be a real boy or a real girl. I wish I didn't have to be real to be allowed to exist. The puppeteers string me.
Well, thank you for sharing that video, Lesley. It was so engaging. I was kind of like, I didn't really want it to end, but thank you very much for sharing that. So I guess for anyone that's just joined us, we're now heading into the first segment of our event. So it's architectural critique, form, and what else?
And I guess I begin the segment by just reading a snippet from our text, which we wrote as a kind of supporting piece for this event. And I guess we raised some questions in that short text. We want to kind of challenge the status quo that asks, what if there were other ways of seeing good architecture introduced? What if, for instance, we didn't prioritize form solely in the writing and critique of architecture, but ask questions about a community's reflections on space, for instance? Or what if we questioned more explicitly the power structures or sometimes the violence that actually goes into making architectural production possible? Or what if, what do magazines and journals sacrifice by not talking about informal spaces that are often deemed beyond the architectural, the boundaries of architectural critique? What injustices are reinforced? And to just complete that, of course, they are great writers who talk about form and the formal and physical qualities of architecture. But we want to ask, what does that have to do with architectural critique today? Or where can architectural critique lead to in thinking about these ideas? And I guess my first question is for Rowan. I'd like to start the conversation in thinking about the ways in which you write about architecture, which take on quite formal qualities of architecture, yet I think are quite tempered really effectively by particular details, almost like vignettes with which you're able to speak beyond just the physical qualities of the space, but start to speak about a language of making or something that really centers people as part of the building story. And I guess my question is, I'm wondering how you use and conceive that the idea of use, community, and perhaps even emotion in your writing to generate something that goes beyond just mere form.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that form is a kind of overrated way of talking about architecture. It's one of many different aspects of architecture: atmosphere, light, use, organization, relationships. And it's interesting that you choose Palladio, because I think he's a very guilty man in this respect. He was an architect who he was one of the first architects to make architecture about architecture, I would say. Which has been a kind of a curse ever since. So yeah, I'm very pleased you spotted those qualities in my writing, because that is always what I'm trying to look for, is what lies behind the form. And it's always, it's difficult, and you also have to sort of decide which qualities you're going to privilege or which issues you're going to privilege, and you don't always get it right. I mean, I think it's interesting to ask why people get so obsessed with form. And one is that it's easy. It's the easiest thing to write about in architecture, because it's kind of dead. It's like lying in front of you on the microscope slide, and it's not going to go anywhere. And it's the easiest thing is just to look at it and sort of anatomize it. And And if you start bringing in these other issues, it becomes much more kind of fluid and risky. And the other thing, of course, is it does serve certain agendas to focus on form, which I think we're seeing very clearly with the kind of Roger Scruton beauty agenda that the government is now pursuing. And it's something we've heard a lot for decades, is that people of a certain position say, oh, why doesn't anyone talk about beauty? Why don't architects talk about beauty? Which is not really true, because in fact architects do talk about beauty. But and then they say, well, this is what beauty is, and they mean basically Palladian or sort of classical architecture. And then, of course, that just completely closes down the argument of, well, beautiful to who, beautiful in what way, beautiful in what circumstances, and it just takes all the sort of politics and content and ideology out of it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, I think it really does, and I think there's something really interesting here. And I'm looking to Lesley here. In your piece in the New Daughters of Africa collection, you talk about the kind of intersections and relationships between literature and architecture and the sort of in-betweens, and actually letting one piece of work affect the other. And I think I'm sort of getting something from Rowan here about talking about the kind of emotion beyond just the sort of dead object. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how you kind of construct writing and talking about architecture in a way that is perhaps goes beyond and starts to bring emotion and people. And I think that as a writer, as a kind of fictional writer, there's also something that I think your work does very well in tempering those two sorts of practices of writing.
When I first started writing fiction, the first thing that people would say to me is, oh my God, that's so different from architecture. And for me, it was such a strange comment, because fiction and drawing, if you like, are the same thing. And I think, you know, particularly as a student of architecture, that I'm not a practicing architect, so I don't know how much this impetus would stay had I practiced. But I think as a student of architecture, you're always trying to tell a story. I mean, that narrative, that story is your story, it's your interests, it's your obsessions, you know, it's all of those things. And you use the tools of architecture in a sense to construct the narrative. I would say fiction is almost identical. Mm. I think where fiction and architecture start to diverge is to do with what's acceptable, what's permissible, what's expected. And I think certainly for me as a student of architecture, I'm talking 30 years ago, that the range of stories that I was expected to tell was quite narrow. And in a sense, that was why I escaped, in inverted commas, to fiction, because I thought it was a medium that was more expansive. Mm. But what's been really interesting over the past, I would say, 5-7 years, is actually architecture as a discipline seems to be catching up. So I'm beginning to see much more expansive stories being attempted, particularly by young students of color, which will eventually change, I think, the landscape of what is expected and what is, and I use the word allowed in inverted commas, because I think, you know, part of the journey is also to claim that space. You know, if you sit around waiting for it to be given, it will never appear. So I think there's something about using both disciplines as languages, as vocabulary, as syntax, all of those sorts of things. So for me, it was never that the dead object couldn't carry the weight of what I wanted to say.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it moves me on nicely to a question for Leopold, who I think your magazine, The Funambulist, started off with a kind of talking perhaps quite strictly about architecture, but it now seems to have evolved into something that is dealing perhaps with the limitations of architecture, and perhaps the sort of sometimes the violence and dangers of architecture. And I wonder if you would could talk perhaps a bit about this move towards the less formal, but more actually acknowledging the limitations of architecture and what that does in terms of your writing and the things that you want to give space to.
Thanks, Nana. Yeah, I think, I mean, if I want to be provocative, maybe I would say that I'm actually all about form. Like for me, it's my approach to architecture is all about form, but not form as a visual dimension, but as a physical dimension. And it's funny because I really know less than I probably should about Palladio, but since you used him, the only time ever I used like the Villa Rotonda as a sort of reference was to talk about the invention of something we kind of take for granted in architecture, but the invention of the corridor, and how the corridor is this hyperformal typology that very much participate to what has been my definition of architecture for the last 10 years, which is that the discipline that organizes bodies in space, and so nothing more than a wall or two walls parallel to each other, something we call the corridor, to me accomplishes that insofar that it sort of forces a body to go from point A to point B, and sometimes from point A to point B, from point B to point A, but quite often as well only from point A to point B, in a sort of very sort of coercitive effort. And so for me, yeah, if I would say I'm sort of looking at the hyper physicality of architecture as an entrance door to talk about something else, because you're right. I think the path you're describing is perhaps what I used to be doing, which is to perhaps try to bring the political within architecture, whereas now I'm more interested in bringing, if not architecture, let's say space into the political struggles, because that's something we also take for granted when we are architects, perhaps, that our relationship to the world is mostly going through the idea of space and looking at and having this sort of what I like to call those contact lens, like perceiving the world through space, which makes it difficult sometimes to perceive it through other things. Like I've been mildly obsessed with time recently, and I feel like a beginner about perceiving the world through time. But I think that's something we have, actually. That's something we have, and that's something that can perhaps make us useful in various political struggles that approaches the structures of power through various dimensions. I mean, be it like the symbolical, the aesthetic, the sonic, the what else? The tastes. I mean, many other dimensions. The anthropological, of course, but then sometimes the spatial could be an interesting thing. So I would say that my own writing as a clumsy writer would be maybe more dedicated to architecture as a political weapon, whereas the magazine itself, which is really much more of my work, really, is maybe a little bit more tangential to architecture and thinking about space more than architecture.
Great. Thank you.
I think speaking about the politics of architecture, or using architecture as a tool to kind of politicize space, is something that's like really interesting to each of us at N.A.W. And I think I've got a question for you, Owen, because you write extensively about politics, culture, and the aesthetics of buildings. And having written books on these themes, particularly in your book, The Adventures of Owen Hatherley in the Post-Servian Place, you often do away with this kind of fetishization of aesthetics, and instead, like, you really opt to tell the readers a story about the building, explaining the history, the social and kind of economic context. And I guess my question to you is, why do you think this is important? And do you think these aspects are currently missing in architectural history and architectural education?
Yes, I suppose I've got various sort of notes for this question, so I'll try and go through those. And apologies for the psychedelic background, by the way. I don't know quite why this is happening to me. I tried to sort of move it around to see if I would be less psychedelic somewhere else, and then I just disappeared completely. So I think it sort of varies from place to place and time to time, but when we're talking about modern architecture in the UK, you're usually talking about a story which is inextricably linked to class and history and race and urban planning, and taking all of those things out and just sort of treating them as sort of decontextualized objects is, I think, first a way that you kind of miss a great many kind of political stories, and is also just incredibly boring by comparison. Like more than anything else, just kind of treating your average kind of block of Haringey council flats from 1970 as if it's a building by Palladio is just boring. I think Colin Rowe has a lot to answer for. So to kind of use some specific examples as to why I think that's the case, I would kind of, before that, it's not really about sort of physical, not physical. I think that's a slightly or sort of formal and not formal. What I'm usually trying to do is talk about particular kind of physical properties in the building or formal properties in the building and how they work with all of these extraneous non-architectural or apparently non-architectural things like sort of class and space and capital and so on. So one of the really obvious examples is the kind of more high profile kind of campaigns to save or regenerate council estates in Britain over the last 10 years. The Robin Hood Gardens preservation campaign seemed to proceed much of the time as if the people who lived there were utterly irrelevant, which sort of paralleled in a kind of strange way the way the council themselves kind of talked about it. So you had this kind of two-level thing where on the one hand, the council were kind of going, look, these architects, these awful bloody architects, like this terrible concrete monstrosity, which they would never live in. And we are going to, save the residents by doing what? It seemed that what they were actually going to do is move the residents to a different part of the borough and build a load of luxury flats on the place of Robin Hood Gardens. But rather than talk about that, what we all talked about is the Smithsons. And we all sort of talked about, the kind of fashionability or not of brutalist architecture, well, the actual history of the site, what the people who lived there wanted to do with it, who the people that lived there were, the fact that it was, an overwhelmingly Silheti community, for instance, which is never mentioned, apart from, I can count the kind of critics that mention this in one hand, out of the dozens and dozens and dozens of articles about Robin Hood Gardens. So this thing just became purely this kind of, what was actually, as far as I was concerned, a story about an attempt at making a social architecture that was then sort of overtaken by changes in housing provision, changes in housing funding and so forth, that was then kind of just became this really boring thing about concrete and deck access, whether it was good or not, and whether or not the Smithsons were interesting. And, these things that are part of it. The Smithsons are part of the story, but to make them the whole story was, I think, extremely dubious. And to make brutalism the whole story was extremely dubious. And you could see by the way that a lot of people kind of talked about how they wanted to see Robin Hood Gardens saved. One of the examples you would see quite a lot is Park Hill in Sheffield, which again was a sort of large and ethnically mixed council estate in the centre of Sheffield, which had been sort of decanted, to use the euphemism, over several years. And then one block of this gigantic estate was sold mostly to kind of people that work at the nearby universities. And this was nominated for the Sterling Prize. 4/5 of the estate were still derelict. The entire thing had involved, kind of reducing the amount of council housing in the city by about 1,000 units in a city which had thousands of people on its council waiting list. The demand for the flats would have been very high as council flats. But instead, again, we talked about kind of fashion and nostalgia and brutalism and architecture, rather than talking about the fact that what was happening was, in terms of housing, an absolute scandal. The fact, and just simply the fact that an unfinished building was nominated for the Sterling Prize suggested that a whole load of people had never actually been to it. Which again, I think is a thing that I sort of tried to stress, is that you should always go to things. And that sort of goes back to the sort of physical question. I think there's absolutely no substitute ever for going to the site of a building and walking around and trying to get the sense of it as it exists in actual real time. And you can see that similarly in the kind of debate over something like the Elephant and Castle. And that kind of links to a sort of another reason why to kind of bring these things in, is that you then are able to find out what happens to a building after, in the case of the Elephant, not only comes out of the hands of its architect, but comes out of the hands of its original owners. And after the kind of class and race makeup of that area changes completely from when it was built in 1964. So people who hadn't been to the Elephant and Castle wrote about it as a failed 60s shopping mall. People that had been to the Elephant and Castle wrote about it as what it is, which is a mainly Latin American center for shopping and restaurants and so forth, with a bowling alley on the top and a bingo hall that the elderly use, which otherwise had very few spaces in the area. That was what it actually was. And in many ways, they were working against the building in some ways and working with it in others. A lot of the way the space was used, the way these kind of very high ceiling spaces were used, the way the very generous circulation of the building was used, were architectural and they were formal. And they were, rather than a kind of like, fuck you to the original architecture, they were a kind of way of interpreting it that you wouldn't have thought of necessarily if you were seeing it in a kind of strictly kind of architectural history manner. So I suppose those are all kind of examples where you've got a kind of original function that's still sort of necessary, where you've kind of got something that's happening that critics are ignoring. But I suppose there was something that I could have thought of, kind of like, okay, well, what if you have a building whose original function is absolutely obsolete and the politics that made it happen is absolutely obsolete? What do you do with that? And there I kind of thought of a story which I was really disturbed by about 3 years ago, which was the refurbishment of a holiday camp which the Third Reich built for tourism in the Isle of Rügen in northeastern Germany in the mid-30s. It was, I think, at the time, one of the longest buildings ever built, and never really became a holiday camp as planned. It was never finished, and it ended up being used as a camp mainly to train, I believe, SS officers. And after kind of being semi-derelict and used as a kind of YMCA for a while, in recent years, a developer has bought it up and is selling it as luxury flats. So you had this kind of, there's conflict between the fact that there was a small museum on the site, about the site, which had kind of proposals for kind of continuing to kind of have a YMCA on the site and have the rest of it as a sort of documentation center about everyday life in the Third Reich. And instead, there was this kind of idea of like, no, this is just a shell, that history is over. We have too many monuments in Germany. Let's sell it as luxury flats. And that I found incredibly disturbing, that you are literally like, having a luxury seaside flat on an SS training camp. And I think if you kind of when people kind of want to sort of take sort of buildings completely out of history and see them purely as form, there's always a limit, isn't there? There's always a limit. There's always a point where it's like, yes, but do you really think that there should be luxury flats and SS holiday camps? I would probably say no. I think most people would say no, but obviously the developers didn't. So those are sort of roughly the reasons why I think those things are important. But I don't really see it as kind of exclusive to talking about architecture. I think one can talk about these things in an architectural way, so to speak, rather than kind of doing sort of pure sociology or pure architecture. I think it's much more interesting to see these as sort of interconnecting and overlapping.
I think that's really interesting, and what I really got out of what you're talking about is a kind of a people-centered narrative in architecture, and that sort of speaks to a kind of thing of democratizing the space of architecture and letting it be about also the other things within the kind of democracy that contribute to how we make spaces and live in. And I'm remembering a conversation we had with Tom talking about forms of making architectural journalism, and we talked we were doing a workshop on broadcasting, and that seemed to me like a very interesting way of making architectural journalism and architectural history accessible. And this kind of thing about democratizing and accessibility, I wondered if Tom could perhaps speak a bit on that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, when we did that workshop all those, gosh, it seems like a long time ago, I sort of went on about, which we haven't discussed so far this evening, the incredible shifts that have taken place in communication and media communication over the last 25 years, obviously the internet. And actually my career, such as it is, has kind of is almost as long as the internet, if you like, in certainly as users of kind of mass media. Over the past sort of 25 years, I left the Bartlett in about 1995-6. And I had a job then. My first job was on an architectural magazine where everything was physical paper, and everything. I think we just about had email. I'm just trying to remember all that time back. What's fascinating about what's happened since then is the internet has allowed this incredible proliferation of channels of communication, which has been wonderful. So that the so-called power of the critic or of the writer has diminished, I would say, certainly over the last 25 years, with good reason. Accessibility to the potential to be a critic or to be a writer or to be a commentator or to produce media about architecture has proliferated in a fantastic time, and I'm incredibly optimistic at the moment about that proliferation of access to writing about and commenting and producing media about architecture. You talked about television. I mean, there was a time maybe in the 70s and 80s where television and architecture might very well have been a very democratic force. I'm thinking of the impact of, say, something like the birth of Channel 4 in the 1980s. In its early years, it produced some quite incredible media, which completely expanded the popular understanding of key issues like LGBTQ plus programming on ethnicity and diversity, religion, and so on. It was quite an incredible. There was a little glimpse there that television could be something quite democratizing. That obviously is more or less kind of disappeared now. But I think I've probably said to you, Shawn and Nana, at the time, I put my faith in people being able to use that great phrase, the means of production. This thing, the phone, to produce films, to produce media, podcasts, etc. Now it's so much easier. You don't have to wait for the bloody BBC or Channel 4. You can go and do it yourself. And I think actually within architecture, it's beginning to be done a bit more now. But certainly by comparison with other subject areas and fields, it hasn't really been exploited to its greatest potential, particularly video. I'd love to see a new generation of filmmakers and video makers using using the internet to get their ideas about architecture out there in a great way. The interesting thing now about the internet is that, okay, perhaps it's diminished quite rightly the power of the kind of the gatekeeper critics, who had this kind of great power, in the 70s and 80s. But perhaps that power has now been dispersed in a really interesting and as yet to be really understood way. Perhaps the power happens in a different way. I think we live in such completely fascinating times with regard to how how the internet might be exploited.
I think that's really interesting. And on these ideas, I'd like to kind of open up the floor a bit more between our invited guests and get a bit of a conversation going. And I think these things that you talk about democratizing space and democratizing who writes and all these questions are really important. And as a Black woman and as an architect and as a writer, I think these things become very central to the practice of architecture and critique, because it's about opening a floor to a kind of generation of Black and BAME architects and writers and these things. And I kind of want to have a bit of a conversation about this idea of democracy, access and openness, and what that means for the things that the ways in which architectural journalism might change. So I open the floor up to all 5 of you and invite comments, and let's have a bit of a chat between us about it.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. Whenever the conversation around BAME, BIPOC, whatever the euphemism is, and architecture comes up, there are certain keywords that always enter the conversation. You know, democratizing, accessibility, opening up. There's a way of speaking about it as if somehow the fact that we are somehow democratic means that we will have other voices. But I'm really interested in how does one construct the space and the place to nurture those voices, because, you know, the ability to speak is only one step. And I mean, I remember talking about this in South Africa constantly. To be angry, to be enraged by a situation, to want to change it is really only the first step. You need, I think, to work with that anger. You have to work with the rage. You have to work with the sense of injustice in order to develop it to become something. It's not enough just to be allowed to speak. You have to be clear about what is it you want to say. So, you know, in a lot of these kinds of conversations, particularly in these kinds of forums, you know, everybody skirts around for the first sort of 20 or 30 minutes, kind of stating their position. And then the conversation kind of slowly gets round to the point. And I'm really curious to hear from my, you know, fellow panelists, how do we open up this territory specifically to young Black and minority architects, like really specifically?
I think the problem is being heard, really. I mean, as Tom said, there is this space and anybody can put things into this space. But then so much stuff is being put into the space that who actually gets heard and who's listening, and even who in the world of architectural criticism and theory and architects are really talking to each other. I don't know the answer, I'm just posing that as a...
But it seems to me that there is something here about skill. There's something here about the ability to edit. There's something here about the ability to be clear, to be precise. Because in a context where everybody's screaming and shouting, and, you know, there are a million narratives going, and this is a particular story that you want to tell, how do we refine, support, encourage, distill, you know, make better this narrative? And it seems to me, you know, the video that I showed at the beginning was kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. And one was very simple, which was that the student in question wanted to be able to say something that would normally have been confined to the history and theory portion of the curriculum in her design work. And what we had to do was to combine those two things. You can use part, if you like, of your credits of your history and theory to say something that you would say in studio. But in assessing it, none of us were actors or performers. We didn't know how to assess the performance aspect of what she'd done. So suddenly the question of who critiques or who supervises, like very, very kind of basic questions were suddenly up for grabs. And it seems to me that, you know, we're talking about things like video, new media, and yet the same tools that we have in the academy are meant for a different kind of audience. They're meant for a different kind of writer, and they're meant for a different kind of listener. So how do we put new tools, new expertise, new hierarchies in place in order very specifically to encourage this voice?
Well, I think one of the places, as you've shown, Lesley, is within academia. Certainly, as you know, if you look at what's happened to the media over the past 25 years, you've essentially had, if you like, the kind of diminishing of traditional media, so a newspaper, or a place like the BBC is meant to kind of represent the nation, or a newspaper that's meant to represent a certain political spectrum. That's kind of, obviously the power is still there, but that is nonetheless diminished. And that kind of almost kind of idealism that we perhaps once had decades ago, that, you know, we have to wait for our turn for the BBC to acknowledge us and then come on and have our say. Great, fantastic. Well, what's replaced that has been the kind of slightly wild west of the internet, where of course anyone can go and write their blog, but of course who's going to read the blog, or who's going to watch the blog? And if you're lucky, it will get read, and you'll go on to great things. But of course, you know, there are many other blogs and podcasts and so on that are not read and not watched, so on. It's very hard to get your voice heard now. Yes, okay, the access to the channels of communication is much easier, but equally trying to get your voice heard is so much harder, because there are so many voices out there, so many things competing for our attention all the time. I'm somebody that has moved away in recent years from the media. I feel a bit like an interloper, because I haven't really written about architecture in any sense really for 8 years or so. And in recent years have gone into teaching, and there it's been very interesting to move into teaching and to move into academia, because those skills that you were talking about, Lesley, that idea how you nurture people, how you give people confidence to speak, and also how you give them those old kind of old-fashioned skills, if you like, that I certainly learned when I began to be a writer, which was how to write and how to edit, and somebody to tell me how to write and how to edit. Certainly, I've seen, and I'm not somebody that has studied architecture from my undergraduate degree, so I haven't had that kind of architecture education. But moving into architecture education, it's really fascinating to me to see how certainly traditionally skills of communication are not valued, and skills of communication where they are valued, it's mostly architects talking to other architects, talking to other architects, talking to other architects. And one of the things I've certainly been very keen to encourage is to try and bring some sense of value in words, in writing, in reading, in making films and video and photography within academia. And I've certainly found, and I'm probably privileged because I teach in two places where this has been fostered over the last few years, at the Bartlett and Central St Martin's, that there has been afforded that opportunity to experiment, to try things out, to try and nurture skills. And of course, things like the new Architecture Writers program is utterly fantastic, and it's doing incredibly interesting and good work. But of course, more of those kind of nurturing spaces need to be found.
Well, thank you, Tom. We appreciate the very complimentary thoughts. I'd like to throw it to Leopold a bit here, because I think, Leopold, the Funambulist magazine is doing a bit of these things that I think we're sort of talking about here. And I really enjoy the way in which you used architecture as a springboard for talking about other things, talking about other inequalities, and championing, by the subject matter which you choose to prioritize, other voices. And I think that becomes a really interesting thing between who gets to say what and what they will say, or what would be the interest in what they choose to write about. And I'm really interested, for instance, in the most recent edition, where there is, which focuses on food and space, food, and colonialism. And these kinds of three threads start to weave something quite nice about how we use architecture or space to talk about larger societal issues. And I'm just wondering a bit if you can talk about the ways in which you go about constructing the kind of things that you want the magazine and podcast to talk about and dissect.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think perhaps it basically consists in reversing the entire sort of referential, because I think if there's one voice that is other because of their social position in the magazine, that would be mine in that case. So, and to answer Lesley's questions very directly, I think perhaps before even tools, it's really just a matter of putting value at the exact opposite of where we usually put value, which is usually we would think that the least someone who writes is connected to the topic, the more this person has a chance to be like dispassionate, objective, and very sort of have very sort of looking above viewpoints that architects are by definition, and I think that's what makes architecture a very wide discipline to begin with, is this sort of looking above imperial gaze. And so once you revert this and you put value where knowledge is incarnated, and I mean, I think having been to Lesley's formidable graduate school of architecture in Johannesburg, I think that's exactly what's happening there. Is like you see Black students, whether South African or from other parts of the continent, and even other non-Black and non-white students, who all in a sudden get to translate their own sort of experience into something that is being given value, and you see the result is just absolutely mind-blowing. And it's kind of, I'm sorry, I should not say that, but it's kind of funny to see the white students being a bit lost at doing things that for which they would receive value somewhere else, and for which they do receive value. I don't want to I don't want to create any problem, but clearly when I'm there, I'm not interested in what they have to say, because clearly they're at loss. And so reverting this entire system of value, I think is really one of the aspects of the answer, and it's a very simple thing, and it's a very sort of natural thing once it is implemented.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant point. I mean, I think, and I'm pretty sure that there are some ex-students and tutors from the GSA who are on this call, or on this, what do we call this, room space? But the most important thing, I think, was the moment at which Black students were able to recognize value in their own experiences. They were able to construct a level playing field. So they were not playing catch up. They were not being given space. They were not being tolerated. There was nothing, there was no concession made. They simply occupied their own space in their own way, with their own tools and their own narratives. And suddenly, those 2 or 3 or 6 sets of narratives were able to exist simultaneously. And that act of getting those students to the point of confidence was, I think, the act of teaching. You know, for me, it was never about the curriculum or the syllabus or, you know, what we were supposed to do. This was a completely different, it was kind of a different teaching experience. And that has been surprisingly hard to replicate. And so I wonder, in the end, is it down to the appetite in the context in which one is, where the university is, or the college or the school or wherever? Is it down to the appetite of the audience to make this work? Because if there is no appetite for it, it won't. And that's why I think that, you know, fora like this are so important, because you clearly have this appetite. And it's almost alchemy. And it has nothing, I think, to do with the conventional teaching tools, which is it's very humbling at one level, but also incredibly empowering.
What Tom was saying is something about architects not learning how to communicate is something I've heard all my career in relation to, and also not learning how to talk to people who are not architects. Is a very familiar story. And the really big and difficult thing is how we, new architectural writers, get outside the space we're in now and actually really do engage with a wider world. And so we are in this situation where, in fact, you know, the world I've always inhabited of architectural magazines and print media and so on has actually shrunk rather a lot, and it was never very big to start with in terms of the amount of jobs going around and the amount of money being paid, and you know, that's just getting smaller and smaller. And then, you know, the internet has created this big space, but in which you really have to fight to get heard. And so maybe there's an opportunity there for whoever can crack this question of how you really find an effective way of communicating, which is also can be a new way of communicating, which can also be talking about new issues that aren't previously talked about. That's this incredible opportunity, but no one seems to know what that is yet. I mean, you know, how do you make an architectural article viral, or an architectural piece of film? You know, maybe that's something that somehow could be explored in architecture schools.
I mean, I have to say, I see it all around me, and I see it particularly in those places where students, for all kinds of social, cultural, political, sometimes racial reasons, just think that what they're being given isn't enough, that there's a kind of paucity there. And what's really fascinating over maybe the past 5 years is that, you know, at the same time as there's been this explosion in terms of media, there's also been a kind of expansion in terms of what is architecture. I mean, I think all the way from the relationship between space and politics, you know, thinking about Leopold's work, you know, there's a whole spectrum now of what people understand to be architectural, not just architecture. And so that there is a sense that the discipline is expanding, which I think is only a good thing. What still preoccupies me, though, is, and I think somebody's put this into the chat, is how do we construct the yardsticks by which we measure this work? Because that, to me, seems to be the key issue. When I first arrived in South Africa, I saw this, and I see this in the United States, this really insidious situation where if a Black student can speak 3 words of English and has a reasonable amount of confidence, they're hailed as if they're the next Einstein. And so anything that comes out of their mouth is de facto amazing. I mean, if I hear that word one more time, I think I'll puke. But the real damage is that because no one is interrogating, supporting, finessing what it is that the student says, they walk out with a completely distorted sense of their own abilities. And they're, in a sense, they simply reinforce the existing paradigm. So, you know, we have to collectively construct these yardsticks. And I mean, it may be that there's not one single one. There might be multiple ways of understanding new and inventive and creative work. But I think we can't shirk the responsibility of critiquing it.
I wonder actually if Victoria is in the audience and we'd like to open the floor up to take questions and observations and thoughts, and really open up the space. So if Victoria, you are able, do you want to expand a bit on what Lesley's just started to talk about?
Hi everyone. I mean, no, not in particular. I think it just maybe echoes what Lesley Lokko has just said, but I think my concern is that if it's one collective yardstick, is there the possibility of enacting continued exclusions, which we've already seen, or does it need to be something that is more, that there can be multiple yardsticks? It can be something operating according to relationalities or something like that. I'm not quite sure what this needs to look like. I guess I'm more interested in what the process of building that and who can be involved in building that. I think that's particularly powerful. So maybe not so much focusing on what in the end is the yardstick, but the process of bringing people in order to build those different yardsticks could be really beautiful.
I think that idea of multiple yardsticks is somehow inevitable, because we're in a situation now where we don't rely upon, you know, this thing called the critic to tell us what good architecture is. There are obviously multiple good architectures, or multiple architectures that perform in a particular way. The challenge, I guess, is more that those of us that have particular, perhaps, ideas about social change or political change, how we form, I suppose, a consensus, or form a kind of, not bubble, but how we agree amongst ourselves what that yardstick is, without it just becoming a whole series of kind of relativist or relativism in some kind of way. You know, particularly if we're talking about how politics connects to architecture, intersectionality and positionality and so on. You know, it's such a complicated question. It's also about how to connect with an audience as well in some way, and that, I think, is one of the key things. You know, one of the more successful recent platforms for communication and nurturing have been those, I think, that have formed a very deep and nurturing relationship with their audience as well. And that might be something like, in art criticism, the White Cube site, for instance, which has spent a long time nurturing their audience and having this kind of conversation between it's almost like kind of co-production of media. That, I think, is the most encouraging part of where the media might take us now, this kind of co-production, nurturing conversation between, in inverted commas, writers or producers of media and consumers of media. In fact, both are kind of blurring into one another now. That, to me, seems the most interesting area.
I think kind of going back to what Leopold was saying, I think again, when we're talking, and also speaking to what Lesley said, again, when we're talking about like the students or the kind of new next generation of writers, or this kind of emerging writers that are trying to speak of these different kind of parts of architecture, or discuss different kind of dialogues that aren't normally kind of addressed, I think that it is worth kind of stating these kind of platforms of your organizations or actual journals giving the young writers are platforms, because I think what was really powerful and I thought worked really well in the Funambulist recently was these game-changing architecture graduates, because this was giving them a platform, giving them the legitimacy that they deserve, and it allowed them to really voice these different narratives for architecture. And I think reading through them, everyone's kind of realized that, wow, this is better than kind of seeing the kind of usual suspects when it comes to the architectural discourse. But to kind of move on, I think we're kind of running out of time, and we've had such an amazing discussion. But I think it is the perfect time to kind of open the floor now to some questions, because I can see so many people are kind of knocking on the doors of this kind of Zoom discussion. And I think the first question that I want to read out is actually Matthew Maganga. So sorry if I pronounced your last name incorrectly, and I invite you to ask your question, or I can read it out if you would prefer.
Yeah, I can ask the question.
Brilliant.
I just wanted to ask, the language used in architectural critique discourse, I find it's quite complex to those outside the world of architecture. So I'd just like to ask, what impact do you think the language used to critique architecture has in making architectural critique more accessible to those outside the community?
Yeah, I quite agree. I mean, I think architectural language can be ridiculous in the way it sort of doesn't help people to access the subject from outside. I mean, in my job, I'm always having to think about how it's going to read to somebody who doesn't know much about architecture. So yeah, I mean, I think direct language needs to be used that really speaks to people's experiences.
Can I come in on that? I think there's a kind of empiricism that can kind of, I suppose, so we'll put it this way. I have no particular architectural background, have never studied architecture at any level. And in many ways, when I sort of started out doing this as a blogger, was very much sort of learning on the job. And I think that there's a thing that always occurs to me that when people talk about kind of difficulty in language, which is from Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. And what everyone kind of misses in that book is that so much of it is about teaching incredibly complicated philosophy at an FE college in Orpington. And how much he has this kind of question of people sort of wanting to be given, let's say, Nietzsche in this kind of like incredibly kind of bite-sized way, so they can then pass the exam with the question on Nietzsche. And Mark's kind of point in there was always the kind of the difficulty is part of the point. The difficulty is sort of inherent in this, that a difficult idea is difficult. And I think that rather there's a kind of sort of two levels, I think, of one of which, two sort of responses one can make as a critic that is working in something completely non-architectural. Like most of what I do is not in architectural magazines, which is to try, you can either sort of go, all of this stuff is nonsense, which sometimes it is, sometimes there is genuine nonsense in architectural discourse. I think it's slightly less bad than it was about 10 years ago. you hear a bit less to lose, which is nice. But there's some of the time you are dealing with genuinely complex concepts, and I think one has to kind of, you know, be sort of honest about the difficulty a lot of the time, as well as being clear, if that makes sense.
But you see, I do think that there's a really big difference between things that are complex and things that are complicated, and particularly in relation to Black students. Sometime many, well, I don't know, 5 years ago or so in Johannesburg, there was a book going around which was about architectural language. It was kind of like the phrases that every young architect needs to know. And that book was being passed around students who didn't, or the tutors who were passing it around didn't understand that the book was ironic. So what happened over the period of 2 or 3 years, and I saw those students come through the schools, they had adopted the language. So, you know, they had been somehow told to say that it is better to say my building situates itself rather than say my building is. But that misunderstanding that the source material was ironic absolutely damaged a whole swathe of students. And for me, the damage done to, particularly to Black students, was twice as damaging, because you're already talking about a constituency who are other to the canon for all kinds of reasons. What you're trying to do, in a sense, is to build their confidence to be able to take on the canon, to understand the canon in its complexity, not in its complicatedness, because the complicatedness to me is a ruse. It's a kind of, it's a mask. And what we're trying to do, in a sense, is to strip away the mask and allow, and when I say other, I don't mean other in inverted commas. I'm saying multiple voices to say the same complexity, but maybe say the complexity in different ways. And so for me, it's really not a question about whether it is, you know, complex to understand Nietzsche. This is to do with a kind of obfuscation, like making something so complicated that only the narrowest band of people can understand it.
I mean, I'm fine with that as a distinction, but I think there is a kind of, yeah, I'm fine with the distinction between complicated and complex. I don't.
Can you post things on Pinterest? Not that I want.
So somebody just butted in.
I think it's really interesting that you use the word mask in your description of when you're speaking of like the jargon of architecture, because that's the reality, is jargon. A lot of the time, even though there's quite precise words to describe things, a lot of the time, if architecture is for the people, speaking of the people, why can I not understand what you're saying? And I think there's a real problem there, and it needs to, again, it's not only about democratizing the space, I think it's also democratizing the language, so everyone, it becomes something that's a accessible vehicle for everyone to really voice their opinion. But kind of going back to what the word mask, Ian Jackson has a really good question that uses the same word, and I was hoping that Ian would be able to voice this question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for letting me on. I don't know if it's a question or not. I was just thinking about my students and my Black students and BAME students, and they seem to come from these 4 perspectives. So one taking a kind of Steve Biko approach, I'm just going to write what I want and go for it. Another taking a kind of Spivak approach, saying I can't speak, how do I get my voice? Kind of Fanon approach, if you like, saying I'm going to adopt a white mask, I'm going to try and write in a certain way or speak in a certain way or use a language, that kind of special language we've just been talking about. Or maybe like the Homi Bhabha approach of something in the middle, or adopting and mimicking an accent or a dialect perhaps. But I'm just wondering, are they the only 4 ways in? Is there another way in which Black BAME students can get a voice? So that was just my kind of take on it, and thanks for letting me voice that.
I really enjoy the ways that you're contextualizing these ways of speaking by these writers, who I think really introduce it's really great to think about these ways of being in kind of literal and other forms of writing, and it comes across really clearly. And I'm starting to see a really interesting thread here, and perhaps maybe the addition to that is any of these a true authentic way of speaking, or is there in this conversation, is there really a search for an authentic way of being, and how do you question what authenticity is? And I put that to the panel, to the whole panel.
I mean, for me, the word authentic is the key word here. And somebody, I can't remember, somebody earlier on talked about process. And it put me in mind of, you know, when you studied mathematics, or I mean, I was useless at maths, but the math classes that were slightly more interesting were where the teacher said, I don't need to know what the answer is. I need to be able to see how you worked it out. So somehow in the process of working it out, there was some value in understanding the processes. And I think here we actually are talking about the process of education, the process of becoming authentic, the process of forming yardsticks, and less obsession with the end result or the finished product, and a different lens, if you like, or a different understanding of the time frame, I think is important. When I was in Johannesburg, the vice chancellor at the time used to, you know, really get frustrated with me and say, you know, why do we have so many white academics, professors, and so on? Go and replace them. You know, go and find me black academics. This is what the school needs. And I used to say to him, but you know, Chiliti, we're in the business of making the next generation. You know, they're not out there for us to go and find them. This is a 2-generation project. And when you think about that process over that time frame, or that goal over that time frame, suddenly you are much more sympathetic to the process. The process itself has incredible value. And in that process, sometimes you will get it wrong. Mm-hmm. That's just the way processes are.
I mean, I'd say that we'd like to talk about architecture generally now. I mean, architecture itself is kind of marginalized or becoming less kind of respected and given value in the kind of culture in general. And you know, just in terms of, you know, the opportunities for architects to do what architects should be able to do, you know, those things are really being squeezed. So I think architects in general are going to have to make their own weather more than they have until now. They'll have to invent ways of demonstrating what they can contribute. And then they have the situation of architects from minorities who have never really been listened to very much. So, you know, possibly that creates a kind of very open terrain in which people can just invent new stuff, and they're not going to be paid for it very much in the foreseeable future. So I don't know how people eat, but you know, there is at least the possibility of really reinventing things from the bottom up. And I guess a good starting place for that is to be authentic and not to really pay much attention to the kind of existing canons.
I think we should probably take one more question and then move the conversation onto Twitter. I don't know if anyone's been using the Power versus Palladio hashtag, but for the final question, I would like to invite Juliet Answer to ask the final question.
Hello.
Hi, Juliet.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be called out. I was trying to ask the question about how we can steer away from the white savior narrative. I suppose what I'm trying to say is what can be done to consciously support or promote, nurture, as Lesley was saying, Black-led initiatives or BAME-led initiatives in these spaces, in these acts for change, because there are some that are already out there. But from my own experience, the focus hasn't really shifted much onto these potentially different ways of bringing in Black voices or minority voices. So that's what I was trying to get to really.
I mean, do you know the writer, the rapper Stormzy? He made this really interesting comment, and I read it on BBC News about a month ago, and it was to do with starting his own publishing company. But he also talked about the role of the commissioning editor, and I thought that was a really interesting angle. And he said that one of the issues was that when you receive a manuscript or you receive, you know, a story, you're much more likely to take an interest in it if it resonates with you in some way. And that resonance has maybe to do with the characters, the language, you know, all sorts of things. And if you are reading a story about an experience or somebody's narrative that is in no way familiar to you, you don't have that resonance. So there's something about familiarity that I think is really, really key. And I don't think that the question is about ignoring existing canon. I mean, I think I've said this so many times, I'm beginning to bore myself. You know, diversity and decolonization are gifts to the canon. They enrich the canon, they don't replace it. They make the canon stronger. And so there's an incredible nervousness around, and I've seen this in many, particularly in schools of architecture, there's an incredible nervousness around bringing Black and minority and ethnic and other, or whatever you want to call it, voices, diverse voices into it, for fear that somehow it's going to take the place of. And I think that, for me, that's the wrong way of looking at it. Yes, certain things will be replaced and made better and or maybe reorganized. But the point is to expand this, not to decrease it. Yeah.
Actually, it's about, oh, sorry, Rowan.
No, I just agree. No, I kind of said, yeah, forget about the canon. I didn't really mean that. I mean, you can yes, it's about remaking the canon, have a complete freedom to reinvent it rather than replace it.
I find this, I realize that we're quite over time, but I find this conversation about the canon and what's included or excluded or added to the canon really interesting, especially in light of a program like N.A.W. And in the past few months with Black Lives Matter movements, it's been really interesting to spot the kinds of things that Black and BAME writers are asked to write about and what they're excluded out of writing about. And there's a really interesting thing, I think, in this conversation about the canon and widening the canon and what gets added to it, about how, I think, Lesley, your point about this sort of fear is about then creating silos almost in which Black and BAME voices exist and are not allowed to enter the kind of what is traditionally been offered as space to white writers. And I think that this is perhaps also really, in some ways, coming back to the main topic of power versus Palladio, this idea that why couldn't I, as a Black woman writer, write about Palladio? Why is my voice marginalized or given the job about writing about BAME people in architecture, like myself can sort of encompass all of Black people or BAME people, and asking about why are some voices marginalized to talk about identity only, and why are others get to write about architecture? And I guess there's not really a question in there. It's a kind of observation propelled by this conversation we're having.
Perhaps it's not about necessarily about the canon. I mean, following on from what Lesley said, it's more about thinking about ways of thinking about architecture. And the program that I teach on at the Bartlett, which was established by Adrian Forty and Mark Swennerton in the 1980s, consciously stepped away from the canon, right from the beginning, and instead developed their program about ways of thinking about architecture, i.e. what are the debates, or what are the issues, or what are the challenges, very much bringing all that kind of critical and cultural theory stuff that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s into architecture. And certainly, I've never been exposed to this thing called the canon. I was exposed to this other way of thinking about architecture, and to me it's a much richer way of thinking about architecture, and one that has to this day the program at the Bartletts teaches multiple ways of thinking about architecture, which I think is a completely and utterly enriching and empowering thing.
I mean, there's that great book. No, go ahead.
You sure? Okay, thanks, Lesley. I mean, going back to this idea of reverting the value of discourse essentially and of practice. I think that could be also the other question is like, what do white people, why do white architects have to learn to become better? Because right now they're no good. Like a little bit like I was saying in Johannesburg, it's like what would white students need to learn in order for them to start making sense and not being a loss, as I was describing. And I was thinking Palladio might be interesting as well, because I know that in the brief you called Palladio a white architect, and it's quite interesting to think that he might be the first white architect, as in the formation of whiteness started with colonialism and started with the first sort of crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, and Palladio is sort of contemporary of that. So what does that mean? What does that mean, the production of whiteness through the racist structures towards the architect? And I think, as I said, I think the incarnation as a production of as something of value to be recognized is something that white architects have no idea how to handle. They don't white people, and in particular white male, don't have a body. They don't know what is a body. They don't know it, and so they have to learn. We have to learn. I'm part of them. We have to learn we have to learn what a body is, and in that learning, find value in this incarnation, in a structure of power. But I hope it doesn't sound too abstract. But sorry, yeah, maybe I try to write this rather than say it. Sorry.
No, but I think it's a very very key point. You know, one of the things that the students, particularly in South Africa, taught me, and it was possible there because of the demographics. You know, the Black students were in the majority. One of the things that was very interesting for me as a tutor was to understand that many of the students understood this concept of double vision. They understood this concept of being themselves, but also being looked at. It was kind of like having a 360-degree view, and it's very hard to articulate it, but I could see it in the work. And the minute the school was, as an institution, I mean, somebody has written, you know, be done with the canon. Let me tell you that universities are the last places that want to be done with the canon. You know, the university will hold on to the canon until its last breath. But what was very, very interesting in this situation was that the minute the school was able to validate that special double lens, it suddenly became something of value, and it became something that others could learn to do. White students, Black, everybody could learn from it in the same way that we learn from Palladio. But it was so interesting that the instinct or the intuition was there, and then it was the job of the institution to bend its own structures to accommodate it. So if I think back to that experience, I think actually architecture was insufficient as a vehicle to carry what it was that those students knew. And that was such a profoundly humbling experience as an educator, to recognize, look, there's something there, like I can see it, I can feel it, I can intuit it, but I don't yet know what the structure is to build around it to protect it.
I think that is an amazing point to kind of end the discussion on, because the kind of it focuses on the value that these voices bring, as opposed to just giving them a platform. Is the crux of what we've been trying to kind of tease out in tonight's event.
I wonder if there is room for one last comment from another educator, because I think this is a really interesting thing to just wrap up on, this thing about the encouragement of voices. So I'm going to give the floor to Andrew Clancy, if you're there, to unmute yourself and just make a comment.
Unmute. Oh, yeah. I just really quick, Nana, thanks for this discussion. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I think it's just to pick up on that point that Lesley made there, which is that, and you were talking about as well, which is that actually being able to be open about the fragmented nature of practice, the fragmented nature of our positions, and being able to build, whether one calls it authentic or not, but whether the ability to build a truthful story of one's own relationship to architecture in a curious and open manner is the key challenge. And I think it sort of faces all of us, because there's a contingency to practice, which I know Rowan has sort of decried as being problematic, but I think is rather beautiful. But to be able to navigate it requires a kind of an openness and a plurality of being able to understand that topic from multiple positions. And I feel that in this wonderfully fragmented world that we live in, the university, despite all its problems, despite all its inertia and bureaucracy, is the place for people to have conversations about this stuff, both together and with the students and with others. And I don't mean in the sense of getting a voice as such, because the voice exists, but finding confidence in how they see, and then finding the language by which that voice eventually becomes heard, because that is a process. And for that process to happen, it needs to be sort of incubated. And I don't mean that in some condescending sense. I mean that in the sense that architecture has always found its voice in these kind of bubbles of incubation. And I think that does put pressure on universities to be far more open about the people they bring into the fold and how they actually give them space to develop. I've gone on a bit long, but it is, I feel, a key role that universities are not fully embracing. And I don't mean in the sense of some knee-jerk reaction to diversity. What I mean is a truthful engagement with the actual merits of the diverse voices that we need to engage with to produce the ability to navigate this. And I mean that all of us. Sorry, I've gone on a bit long, Nana, so apologies.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll hand back to Shawn, but I just thought it was a good place to counter.
But yeah, I guess I want to just say a massive thank you to each of our panelists for like allowing this really thoughtful and like thought-provoking discussion to happen, because I think some of the points that you addressed are the well-needed conversations, and to have this over the Zoom space with each of you that we wouldn't normally be able to get in a space because of the kind of geographic locations is fantastic. And I kind of want to just say thank you to everyone that's attended as well and been following the kind of dialogues that we've been putting out for this month for the takeover. We'll be back tomorrow for the recap. So over Instagram Live, we'll be kind of recapping on some of these discussions, bringing maybe even throwing in some of the questions that sadly we weren't able to kind of speak about. But make sure to follow us. Hashtag Power versus Palladio. Make sure you know all of the work of our panelists, and we'll see you back next Thursday for another fantastic event. Thank you, everyone.
No, thanks to you. Thanks to you and everybody and all the questions. Bloody amazing.
Thank you.